A locked door only keeps out the people you haven't decided to trust yet. My bank account had $31,000 in it on a Tuesday morning, and by Friday afternoon I'd have less than 400, because that's what it costs to buy your own daughter a wedding she'll later tell you not to attend. My name is Robert Callahan. Everyone who's known me longer than a week calls me Bob. I'm 59 years old. I own a locksmith and security business in Dayton, Ohio that's carried my last name on the side of a white van for 32 years, and 3 days before my daughter's wedding, she sent me a text message with exactly 6 words in it. Dad, please don't come Saturday. I read it standing in my own garage at 6:15 in the morning with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand, and I want to tell you I felt something dramatic happen in my chest, some crack, some collapse. I didn't. What I felt was quiet, which is the only way I've ever felt anything that mattered. Welcome back to Dad's Sweet Revenge. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, every villain in these stories thought they'd already won. They hadn't. Subscribe so you never miss one. Here's what you need to understand about me before anything else happens. Because a man's occupation tells you more about him than his resume ever will. I've spent 32 years opening locks other people couldn't open and installing locks other people couldn't defeat. I've been inside more houses in this county than the mailman. I've stood in mansions on Fairmont Ridge and duplexes on the east side, and I learned the same lesson in both places, over and over until it stopped surprising me. The size of a person's front door has nothing to do with the size of their character. Some people install a $600 smart lock because they're hiding something worth $600. Some people never lock anything at all because they've got nothing left worth stealing and they've made peace with that. A lock only tells you what someone doesn't want you to see. I've built a business, a house, and a whole philosophy of life around that one sentence, and it has never once failed me, until it almost did. I married my wife Diane when I was 26. She taught second grade at Fairview Elementary for 29 years, and she had this way of looking at a locked door, literal or otherwise, like it was a puzzle worth respecting instead of a problem worth resenting. We had one daughter, Melissa, born the same autumn. I took out a business loan for $4,000 to buy my first real set of pinning tools. Diane used to joke that our whole marriage was built out of things that clicked into place at exactly the right pressure, the lock, the loan, the baby, all in the same 6 months. She had a gift for turning ordinary facts into something that sounded like grace. Deanne died 3 years ago. Breast cancer, 17 months from diagnosis to the funeral, and I'm not going to spend a long time on that part of the story because grief isn't the kind of thing you can hand somebody in a paragraph and expect them to feel the weight of it the way I did. I'll just tell you the number that matters. $22,000 is what our insurance didn't cover. I paid it off in 14 months by taking every emergency lockout call in a 40-mile radius at 2 in the morning, at 4 in the morning, in February, in a snowstorm, because a man alone raising a 26-year-old daughter doesn't get to fall apart on a schedule that's convenient for him. He gets to fall apart in the truck, alone, at red lights, for about 90 seconds at a time, and then he wipes his face and goes and picks the lock on somebody's back door because their kid locked himself in the bathroom. I didn't know it yet, but the version of me that grieved quietly and kept working was about to become the exact thing my daughter would later find embarrassing. Melissa was 29 when this story starts, and she'd grown into a smart, sharp, ambitious woman who worked in marketing for a boutique real estate firm downtown, the kind of place with reclaimed wood tables and an espresso machine that cost more than my first van. I was proud of her in the specific, aching way you're proud of a kid who's built a life that looks nothing like yours. I'd put $118,000 into her college education across 5 years, no loans, because Diane and I had decided the year Melissa was born that this was one door we were going to make sure stayed unlocked for her. 3 years ago, right after Diane's funeral, I gave Melissa $60,000 toward the down payment on her condo downtown. Money I'd been saving since she was in middle school, because grief makes you want to hand people the future faster than they're ready to build it themselves. She hugged me in the parking lot of the title company and cried into my shoulder and said, "You didn't have to do this, Dad." And I said the only true thing I had, which was, "I know. I wanted to." That was 3 years ago. A lot changes in 3 years when somebody starts dating a man named Derek Whitfield. Derek was, by every outward measure, a good match. $28,000 a year in student loans he'd already paid off, a job in commercial real estate development working for his family's company, a firm handshake, decent eye contact, the kind of manners that get complimented at dinner parties. I liked him fine the first few times I met him. What I didn't fully account for, because I was too close to it and too tired from grief to look hard enough, was his mother. Vivian Whitfield ran Whitfield Development alongside her late husband for 30 years before he died, and she'd kept running it alone for the 6 years since, with her older son Trent as her executive vice president, and, as I'd come to understand much later, something closer to the hand actually steering the wheel while everyone assumed it was hers. Vivian had a way of speaking to people in service industries, waiters, contractors, and, as it turned out, locksmiths, that was polite in the specific weaponized way that lets a woman insult you without ever raising her voice or using a single impolite word. The first time I met her, at an engagement dinner at a restaurant where the menu didn't list prices, she looked at my hands, which are a working man's hands, calloused, a little scarred from 32 years of hardware, and said, "Oh, how wonderful, hands-on work. So important, somebody has to do it." She smiled the entire time. It took me 2 full days to understand exactly what she'd said to me. I didn't know it yet, but Vivian Whitfield had already decided, somewhere in the calculus she ran behind that smile, that a locksmith father-in-law didn't belong in the photographs at her son's wedding, and she had 11 months to make sure of it. Here's how it happened, slowly. The way water gets into a foundation crack, you don't see the damage until the wall's already cracked wide open. Melissa started correcting the way I talked about my business. "Dad, you're not a locksmith. You run a security integration company," she told me once gently, the way you'd correct a child. I ran a locksmith shop with 4 employees and a service van. That was the truth, and I'd never been embarrassed by it a single day of my life. But somewhere in her new world, the word itself had started to sound small to her, and she wanted it dressed up before it left her mouth in front of people like Vivian. She started scheduling our visits around Whitfield family events instead of the other way around, the way it had always been. She stopped inviting me to dinners at Derek's parents' house, telling me, "It's just a work thing for Derek, Dad, not really a family thing." Except I found out later from Ava, my mother, 81 years old and sharper than half the people I do business with, that I'd been left off the guest list on purpose, at Vivian's suggestion, because Vivian felt the dynamic would be more comfortable without what she called, in a text message Ava wasn't supposed to see but did, Melissa's father situation. My father situation. I'd raised that girl alone for 3 years after burying her mother, paid for every stitch of her education and half her condo, driven through a snowstorm at 3 in the morning more times than I could count, so she'd never once in her life go without something she needed. And to a woman who'd never worked a day job that required her hands to bleed, I had become a situation. I want to be fair here, because fairness is something I've tried to practice my whole life, even when it costs me something. Melissa wasn't cruel by nature. She's not a cruel person. What happened to her is a thing I've seen happen to good, smart people more times than I'd like to admit. She got absorbed into a world that ran on a different currency than the one she grew up with, and instead of holding her ground, she started translating herself into their language, one small embarrassment at a time, until the translation ate the original. By the time the wedding planning started in earnest, 11 months out, my daughter had learned to apologize for me before I'd even done anything that needed apologizing for. The incident that changed everything happened on a Thursday in March, 6 weeks before the wedding, and I need to tell it to you exactly the way it happened because every detail in it mattered later, more than I understood at the time. Melissa had asked me, back in January, if I'd handle the security system installation for the reception venue, a restored 1920s ballroom called the Ashford House that the Whitfields had rented for the full weekend. cocktail hour through breakfast the next morning. Because apparently, that's what a wedding costs when the groom's family owns half the commercial property in 3 counties. I'd said yes immediately, glad to have something real to give besides money. Something built from the actual skill I'd spent my life mastering. I spent 4 days pulling permits, running new wiring for the perimeter cameras, programming a keypad system for the private bridal suite upstairs where Melissa would get ready. I did it at cost. I didn't charge the Whitfields a dime because it was for my daughter, and because, I'll admit this now, some part of me wanted Vivian Whitfield to watch me work and understand that the man with the calloused hands had built something worth respecting, even if she'd never say so out loud. I was up on a ladder in the Ashford House ballroom on that Thursday afternoon, running the last camera line along the crown molding, wearing my work uniform. Gray shirt with colosicus stitched over the pocket, tool belt, boots with dried concrete on them from a job that morning, when Vivian walked in with 2 women I didn't recognize, some kind of event planning consultation. She stopped short when she saw me. I climbed down off the ladder, wiped my hand on my jeans, and extended it to introduce myself properly, because that's what you do. She looked at my hand for just slightly too long before she took it, the kind of pause that isn't rude enough to call out but is exactly long enough to be felt. "Robert," she said, "I didn't realize you'd be here in person. I assumed you'd send one of your technicians." She said the word technicians like it cost her something to say it about anyone but me, like the actual technicians deserved the dignity of the word, and I somehow didn't. "I like to do the important work myself," I said. This one felt important. She smiled, that same weaponized smile from the engagement dinner. "Of course. Well, we do have the vendor entrance around back, for future reference, if you're ever here during actual event hours. The main entrance photographs beautifully, and we like to keep it." She paused, searching for a word, and landed on one that told me everything. Presentable. I want to tell you I had some clever line ready. I didn't. I'm not built that way, and honestly I've never believed a comeback line changes the truth of a moment more than just standing in it does. I nodded once, said, "Understood," and went back up the ladder and finished the job, because a locked door doesn't care how you feel about the person who hired you to install it. It just needs to work. Melissa called me that night. Someone had told her, one of the consultants, or Vivian herself, dressed up as a concern rather than a complaint, that I'd been unprofessional and confrontational with Vivian at the venue. That's the word they used. Confrontational. I'd said 4 sentences to the woman, and every one of them was true. "Dad, can you please be more careful around Derek's mom? The wedding's in 6 weeks. I need this to go smoothly. I was doing the job you asked me to do, Melissa. I know, and I appreciate it. I do. But you were in your work clothes, Dad, at the actual venue." And Vivian said, "What did Vivian say?" There was a pause on the line that told me more than whatever came after it. "She said it might be better." Melissa said, "Quiet now. If you weren't as, visible during the actual event, like, maybe not walk me down the aisle in front of everyone. Maybe just sit with the family. Have a seat of honor, obviously. But let Derek's dad's brother, Uncle Gerald, do the walk. Since it might just look more." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I finished it for her, silently, standing in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, and Diane's handwriting still on a grocery list magnet on the refrigerator 3 years after she'd written it, because I hadn't been able to make myself take it down, since it might just look more appropriate if the wealthy family's walker and the locksmith sits quietly in the back where he photographs well from a distance. I didn't say any of that out loud. I said, "Okay, Melissa, whatever you need." And I meant it, in the moment, the way you mean things when you love someone more than you love your own dignity. But something in me had shifted, quiet and permanent. The way a tumbler drops into place inside a lock. You don't hear it from outside, but the mechanism is different now. It doesn't open the same way anymore. I didn't know it yet. But that phone call was the last time my daughter would ask me for anything, before she decided, 3 days before her own wedding, that the safest thing to do with her father was remove him from the guest list entirely. The text came on a Wednesday morning, 3 days out, 6 words, no explanation attached to them yet. Dad, please don't come Saturday. I stood in my garage, coffee going cold, staring at my phone for what felt like a long time, but was probably closer to 90 seconds. And then I called her, because 32 years in this business have taught me that you don't guess at what's behind a locked door. You ask, directly, and you wait for the real answer. She picked up on the fourth ring, and I could hear that she'd been crying, or was about to. Dad, I'm so sorry, I don't. Vivian found out that Trent's business partner, one of the investors on the Ashford House renovation loan, he recognized your name from an old permit filing, and there's some kind of history, Dad, some old thing with the family, and Vivian is completely panicked. She says if you're there, something is going to come out publicly that she cannot let come out at her son's wedding, and she told Derek that either you don't come or she pulls the venue funding for the whole reception 48 hours before 200 people show up. And Dad, I don't understand what history she's talking about. I don't understand what you have to do with any of this, but I can't lose the venue. I can't do that to Derek, and I need you to please, just this once, just stay home Saturday. I'll make it up to you. I promise I'll make it up to you. I stood very still in my garage, and for the first time since Diane's diagnosis, I felt something crack open in my chest that I couldn't quiet down with work, because Vivian Whitfield was right to be afraid. There was history, and I was the only person alive who knew exactly what it was, which meant I was also the only person who understood, standing in that garage with a phone against my ear, that my daughter had just banned the one man in the world who could tell her the truth about the family she was marrying into. 3 days before, she walked down an aisle toward a man whose entire life, whether he knew it or not, I had once held in my 2 hands. I said, "Okay, Melissa, I won't come." I was lying. I just didn't know yet how much I meant to keep that promise, or how completely I was about to break it. I want to tell you what I know about locks that most people never think about, because it matters for what happened next. Every deadbolt has what's called a strike plate, a small metal piece mounted on the door frame that the bolt slides into. People spend hundreds of dollars on a beautiful lock and never once check the strike plate, which is usually held on with 2-inch screws, driven into nothing but soft pine trim. The lock can be perfect. The door can still fall open with one good kick, because the weak point was never the lock at all. It was the thing holding the lock in place. Vivian Whitfield had spent 6 years building a beautiful lock around a secret. What she'd never accounted for was that the strike plate, the thing actually holding her family's story together, was a locksmith standing quietly in the back of her son's life the whole time, and she had no idea I knew exactly where the screws were soft. Here's the history she was so afraid of, the one she never named to Melissa, the one she assumed had died with the people who'd witnessed it. 16 years ago, when I was 43 and Derek Whitfield was 12 years old, there was a fire at a mixed-use building called the Larkspur, on the corner of 4th and Wexler, owned at the time by a company called Whitfield Development. I know the address because I was the one who'd installed the security system in that building 11 months earlier, and I know the date, March the 14th, because it is one of exactly 4 dates in my life I will never forget. And the other 3 all belong to Diane and Melissa. I got a call at 11:40 that night from the fire department because the electronic lock system I'd installed on the 4th-floor residential units had a fail-safe override that only I had the master code for, and the fire crew couldn't get past a jammed manual deadbolt on a unit where a woman had reported, through a half-open window 3 floors up, that her son was trapped inside a locked bedroom, and the smoke was already thick enough that she couldn't get back in through the hallway to reach him. I drove 11 minutes through downtown Dayton at 11:50 at night, faster than I have ever driven a vehicle before or since, and when I got there, the building was a wall of orange and gray and noise, and a fire captain named Russo grabbed me by the shoulder and said, "Bob, if your system's got some kind of manual override on that unit, now's the time." Because the fire department's forcible entry tools weren't working fast enough on a door that had been reinforced. Ironically, by a security upgrade the building's insurance policy had required after a break-in the year before. I'd installed that reinforcement myself. I knew exactly how it worked and exactly how to defeat it because I'd built it. I want to be honest with you about this part because false modesty isn't honesty. I went in. Russo and another firefighter went in ahead of me with an axe and a hydraulic spreader, but the manual override sequence on that lock required a physical key sequence I hadn't given to anyone but myself. 16 keystrokes on a keypad that had partially melted on one side, and I punched that sequence in through smoke thick enough that I couldn't see my own hand, coughing, my eyes burning, while Russo held a bunker coat over both of us and screamed at me that I had maybe 45 more seconds before he was pulling me out whether the door opened or not. It opened on the 41st second. There was a 12-year-old boy on the floor of that bedroom, curled against the baseboard where the air was marginally better, conscious but barely, and I carried him out myself because I was closer to the door than either firefighter, and I remember exactly how light he was, how his hair smelled like smoke and Pop-Tarts, and I remember that his name, stitched onto the strap of a backpack lying 3 feet away from him, was Derek W. I didn't know his last name meant anything yet. I found out 3 days later, reading the paper, that the boy I'd carried out of a burning building was the son of the woman who owned it. Here's the part that matters even more than the fire itself, and it's the part I never told anyone, not the reporters who called for a week afterward, not Diane at first, not Melissa ever, because by the time it was relevant to tell her, I'd already decided a long time ago that some things you carry instead of spend. The fire marshal's report, which I read because as I'd installed the building's systems and was required to give a statement, found that the fire had started in a 4th-floor electrical panel that had failed a safety inspection 8 months earlier and had never been repaired, because repairing it would have required shutting down 2 floors of paying tenants for 11 days, and Whitfield Development had made a documented decision, in writing, in a memo I saw a photocopy of because Russo showed it to me off the record, to defer the repair until the next scheduled maintenance cycle 4 months later. The fire happened in month 3. Derek Whitfield's mother had known about that electrical panel. She'd signed the memo herself. Nobody was ever charged. The report got filed, the tenants got relocated and quietly settled with, the building got repaired and eventually sold, and the story that survived in public memory, because Vivian's PR team made very sure of it, was a simple one: electrical fire, tragic but unavoidable, heroic first responders, no fatalities, thank God. My name appeared exactly once, in a single line of the local paper's coverage, misspelled as Callahan, described as a security contractor who assisted first responders. I was never contacted by the family. I never sought them out. I went back to my shop the following Monday and fixed a garage door opener for an elderly woman on Brantley Street who paid me in banana bread, because that's the actual size of most days in a working man's life, heroic or otherwise. I didn't know it yet, but the boy I carried out of that building at 11:58 at night, calming, 16 years old inside my memory forever, no matter how old he actually got, was going to grow up and fall in love with my daughter, and his mother was going to spend 6 years quietly terrified that somewhere in Dayton, Ohio, there was a man who knew exactly what she'd signed her name to, and exactly what it had almost cost her. I found out Derek was that boy 9 months into his and Melissa's relationship at a 4th of July barbecue at my house, my modest 3-bedroom on Reading Street, the one Vivian had never once agreed to visit, when Derek was helping me carry a cooler in from the garage and mentioned, casually the way people mention old scars, that he had a burn mark on the back of his left calf from a house fire when I was a kid. Nothing serious. I don't even remember most of it. I just remember somebody carrying me out, and I never found out who. He rolled up his pant leg to show me, laughing about it. The easy way people laugh about things that happened to them so long ago they've stopped being wounds and started being anecdotes. I looked at that burn scar, 4 inches long, exactly where I remembered the fabric of his pajama pants having melted against his skin 16 years earlier, while I carried him down 3 flights of a stairwell that was actively on fire, and I felt something I have no good word for. Not pride, exactly. Not grief. Something closer to the feeling of finding a key you lost 11 years ago in the pocket of a coat you never wear. I didn't tell him. I want you to understand why. because it's the same reason I never told Melissa about the Larkspur, and it's not a noble reason, not entirely. Part of it was pure logistics. Announcing yourself as the man who saved your daughter's boyfriend from a fire caused by his own mother's negligence is not a conversation starter. It's a bomb, and I didn't have any interest in detonating it at a 4th of July barbecue with a plate of ribs in my hand. But the deeper reason, the true one, the one I only admitted to myself much later, sitting in my truck outside a church I'd been told not to attend, was the same reason I'd never told anyone about the $22,000, or the $60,000 for the condo, or the 11 months I'd spent building this business from a single set of tools in the trunk of a Buick. I didn't do the Larkspur to be known for it. I did it because a 12-year-old boy was on the other side of a door I knew how to open, and that was the whole equation, beginning and end. I wanted it to stay mine the same way I wanted Anchor. No, that's not right. That's a different man's story. I wanted it to stay mine the way you want anything that's genuinely, purely yours in a life that otherwise gets divided up between other people's needs the second you're not looking. I didn't want the fire to become a bargaining chip in whatever complicated arithmetic Vivian Whitfield ran to decide who deserved a seat at her table. I wanted it to just be true quietly, whether anyone else ever knew it or not. What I did not account for, what no locksmith, however good, can ever fully account for, is that some doors get opened by people who never meant to open them at all. Trent Whitfield opened this one. Derek's older brother, 34 years old, executive vice president of Whitfield Development, the man everyone in that family assumed was Vivian's loyal second-in-command, had been quietly restructuring the company's ownership stakes for the better part of 2 years, moving capital, shifting equity, positioning himself, I would learn much later, from documents that would eventually matter a great deal, to force his mother out of controlling interest the moment a specific liability came due. That liability was a class action lawsuit, still simmering after 16 years, filed by 3 former Larkspur tenants who'd never fully settled and had recently retained a new attorney with an appetite for old fires and old memos. Trent knew about the lawsuit, Trent knew about the memo, and Trent, unlike his mother, had decided that if the truth about the Larkspur ever surfaced, he wanted to be standing on the side of the company that survived it. Not the side that got buried with Vivian. I didn't know any of this yet. Sitting in my truck 3 days before the wedding with my daughter's voice still ringing in my ear, please, just this once, just stay home Saturday. But I want you to hold on to Trent's name, because everything that happens at that wedding, everything that makes the groom freeze mid-step and go pale in front of 200 guests, everything that brings Vivian Whitfield's careful architecture down in one afternoon, runs through a decision Trent Whitfield had already made months before I ever got that text message, for reasons that had nothing to do with me, and nothing to do with love, and everything to do with the kind of arithmetic people run when they've decided loyalty is a currency you spend, not a promise you keep. I called my mother Ava that night. She's 81, lives 20 minutes from me in the same house I grew up in, and she has never once in her life said something to me just because it was comfortable to say. They banned you, she said. After I told her everything, her voice flat with a fury she wasn't bothering to soften for my benefit. Melissa banned me, not entirely her choice. It's always somebody's choice, Robert. You didn't get where you are by pretending choices make themselves. A pause, and I could hear her moving in her kitchen, the particular clink of her pouring 2 fingers of the bourbon she keeps for occasions exactly like this one. You're going to that wedding. She asked me not to come, Mom. She asked you not to come because a woman who's never once had to earn a single thing in her whole soft life is more afraid of you than she's ever been afraid of anything. And instead of asking why, your daughter did what that woman told her to do. Ava's voice cracked, just slightly on the word daughter, because she loved Melissa, the way grandmothers love the grandchildren who used to fall asleep against their chest, uncomplicated, before the world got its hands on them. You raised that girl alone, Robert. You buried Diane and you didn't miss a single school pickup the next semester. Not one. I watched you do it. I watched you nearly break in half doing it. And you're going to let a woman who's ashamed of your hands keep you out of the last room your daughter's ever going to need you in. I don't know what walking in there does, Mom. I don't know what it fixes. It's not about fixing anything, Ava said. It's about a lock that's about to fall open whether you're standing there or not. And I would rather my son be standing there when it happens than reading about it in a text message the next morning. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. I thought about the larkspur, about a 12-year-old boy's weight in my arms, about a memo with Vivian Whitfield's signature on it, about a strike plate held on with 2-inch screws driven into soft pine, about the $60,000 and the $118,000 and the $22,000, none of which I regretted for 1 second, all of which had somehow quietly, over 3 years, gotten reclassified in somebody else's ledger as the price of admission for a man who was no longer welcome at the table he'd paid for. I thought about Diane and what she would have said. I already knew, because I'd heard her say versions of it my whole marriage, usually right before she did something quietly, devastatingly right. A locked door isn't an ending, Bob. It's just a question somebody hasn't answered yet. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to answer it. Saturday morning, I put on the only suit I own. Navy, bought for Diane's funeral, worn exactly 4 times since. And I drove to Ashford House, not to the front, not through the vendor entrance either, but to the church 3 blocks away where the ceremony itself was being held, a small stone chapel called St. Bartholomew's that Melissa had picked, ironically, because it reminded her of the church Diane and I had gotten married in 33 years earlier. I parked across the street. I did not go inside. I stood on the sidewalk in my navy suit in the cold, watching 200 guests in silk and pressed linen file through the front doors of a church my daughter had chosen because it reminded her of a marriage I'd built with my own 2 hands. And I told myself I had simply come to see her walk in from a distance. And then I would leave, quietly, the way I'd quietly carried a 12-year-old boy out of a building on fire 16 years ago and never once asked for the credit. That was the plan. Stand outside. Watch. Leave. I didn't know it yet, but plans, like locks, only hold until something with enough pressure behind it decides to test them. And at exactly 11:40 that morning, as the wedding party made their way up the church steps in the receiving line before the ceremony, Derek Whitfield, freshly shaved, boutonniere pinned crooked the way nervous grooms always wear them, laughing at something his best man had just said, happened to glance out across the street at the small crowd of onlookers gathered the way people always gather outside a pretty church on a Saturday morning. His eyes moved past me once, then came back. I watched every trace of laughter leave his face in real time, the way color drains out of a photograph left too long in the sun, and I watched him go completely, utterly still on the top step of St. Bartholomew's, one hand frozen on the church door, his whole body arrested by a 16-year-old memory that had just, without warning, without permission, without a single word being spoken, walked back into his life, wearing a navy suit and standing on the wrong side of the street. I have installed a great many alarm systems in my life, and I can tell you that every single one of them has a moment, right before it triggers, where the sensor has already detected the breach, but the siren hasn't sounded yet. There's a gap, sometimes less than a second, between knowing and announcing. I watched that gap happen on Derek Whitfield's face on the top step of St. Bartholomew's, and I understood, with the particular calm that comes over me only in the moments that matter most, that whatever happened next was no longer something I could control by simply turning around and walking back to my truck. He said something to his best man, who followed his gaze across the street, found nothing remarkable about a 59-year-old man in a navy suit, and clearly asked what was wrong. Derek didn't answer him. He came down the church steps, still in his tuxedo, boutonniere still crooked, and crossed the street toward me with the unsteady, deliberate walk of a man whose legs are moving faster than his mind, has finished processing why. "It's you," he said, when he was close enough that I could see his eyes were wet. "It was you the whole time, Derek." "The scar," he said, and his voice cracked in a way I don't think he expected it to. "On my leg. I asked my dad once, before he died, who carried me out, and he said he didn't know. The fire department report just said a security contractor, and I always, Robert Callahan. He said my name like a man reading a word he'd known his whole life in a language he'd only just learned to translate. You installed our security system. You've been at every family dinner for a year. You're Melissa's dad. You're Melissa's dad. I am, I said. You never said anything. It wasn't mine to make into a conversation, I said, and I meant it. Though I understood in that moment, watching this 28-year-old man standing in the street in his wedding tuxedo trying to hold two irreconcilable facts in his two hands at once, that the choice to stay quiet, which had felt for 16 years like a kind of integrity, had also, without my ever intending it, become a kind of secret, and secrets have a way of outliving the good reasons you had for keeping them. I didn't know it yet, but the gap between knowing and announcing was about to close for both of us, at the same time, in front of 200 people who had come to watch a wedding and were about to witness something else entirely. "Does my mother know?" Derek asked, and something in the way he asked it, not surprised, not confused, but braced, the way you brace for a diagnosis you've already half suspected, told me that some part of him had been circling this truth for longer than the last 4 minutes. "Your mother knows exactly who I am," I said. "She's known for 6 years. It's why I'm standing on this side of the street instead of the other one. She told Melissa that if I came today, something would come out publicly that she couldn't afford, and she was right, Derek. She just never told either of you what the something was." He stood there for a long moment, tuxedo, boutonniere, wet eyes, the sound of a string quartet warming up faintly audible through the church's open doors behind him. And I watched 28 years of a carefully curated family story rearrange itself behind his face in real time. "Tell me," he said, so I did. "Not everything, not yet. Not standing on a sidewalk with a wedding starting in 11 minutes. But enough, the larkspur, the electrical panel, the memo with his mother's signature that Captain Russo had shown me off the record 16 years ago, because he'd trusted me enough to let me see it and never once expected me to use it. The 11 days it would have taken to fix the panel properly, and the 4 months Whitfield Development had chosen to wait instead, because 4 months cost less than 11 days of empty units. I told him I'd carried him out myself, that I remembered exactly how light he was, that I had never once in 16 years told a single soul his name until this morning. Derek Whitfield stood in the street in his wedding suit and wept, not delicately, not the composed tears of a man managing his emotions for an audience, but the full, shaking, silent kind that comes from a much older and much deeper place than the last 4 minutes could account for. And I stood there and let him, because some doors, once they're open, you don't get to close again just because the timing is inconvenient. "She let me almost die," he said finally, "to save 11 days of rent. She made a decision," I said. "And then she spent 16 years making sure nobody ever had to say that sentence out loud, including you." He wiped his face with the back of his hand, smearing nothing because there was nothing on his face to smear. Just water, just the plain evidence of a man discovering the true shape of the family that raised him. "Melissa doesn't know any of this. No, you were going to let me marry into it anyway, weren't you? You were going to stand across the street and just watch. I want to tell you that I had a perfect answer ready, something wise, something that would have made me look, in this story, like the kind of man who always knows exactly the right thing to say. I didn't. I don't know what I was going to do, Derek," I said, and it was the truest sentence I'd spoken all morning. I told my daughter I wouldn't come. I came anyway, because my mother told me a lock that's about to fall open doesn't care whether I'm standing there or not, and I'd rather be standing there than reading about it in a text message tomorrow. I didn't have a plan past that. He looked at me for a long moment, and something in his face changed, hardened slightly, the particular hardening of a young man who has just discovered that the family currency he'd inherited, comfort, reputation, the assumption that difficult things simply get managed rather than survived, had been purchased in part with a debt his own mother had never intended to pay. "I have a plan," he said. "Derek." "I have a plan," he said again, quieter, steadier, wiping his face one final time with the heel of his hand. "And it starts with you coming inside. I didn't know it yet, but the next 40 minutes were going to unmake, in front of 200 witnesses, 6 years of careful architecture that Vivian Whitfield had built, specifically to make sure this exact morning could never happen. He walked me in through the side door, past the coat check, into the vestibule where Melissa was standing with her bridesmaids in a dress that had cost more than I make in 3 good months, hair pinned the way Diane used to pin hers for church, and when she saw me standing beside Derek, whose face was still blotched from crying, whose tuxedo jacket she reached out automatically to straighten before her brain caught up with what she was looking at. Her whole face went through about 4 separate emotions in under 2 seconds. Confusion, then recognition, then fear, then, underneath all of it, something that looked almost like relief, the particular relief of a person who has spent 6 weeks pretending a wall in her chest is load-bearing and has just been told, gently, that it was never structural at all. "Dad," she said, "you said you wouldn't." "I know," I said. "Vivian said if you came, she'd pull the—" "I know that too." Derek took her hands, both of them, tuxedo cuffs against her white gloves, and said quiet enough that only the 4 or 5 of us in the vestibule could hear, "Melissa, I need to tell you something before you walk down that aisle, and I need you to hear all of it before my mother finds a way to make sure you don't." And he told her. Not the whole story, there wasn't time, and some of it, I understood even then, would take years for either of them to fully absorb, but enough. The fire. The scar on his leg he'd shown me at a 4th of July barbecue without either of us understanding what we were looking at. The memo. Her father's hands, 16 years ago, on a keypad melting from heat, punching in a 16-digit sequence through smoke thick enough to blind him. I watched my daughter's face while her fiancé told her that the man she'd banned from her own wedding 3 days earlier had once saved her future husband's life and never once mentioned it, not to leverage it, not to be thanked for it, not for any reason except that it had never occurred to him it was a story that needed telling, and I watched 29 years of a certain kind of shame, the shame she'd absorbed one small correction at a time. One, my dad's not really a locksmith. He runs a security company at a time, one seating chart at a time, collapse under the weight of a truth that had been standing quietly beside her the entire time, waiting, exactly the way I always wait for a client to remember the code themselves before I tell them what it is. "Oh my God," Melissa whispered. "Oh my God, Dad. There's more," Derek said. And his jaw had set into something I hadn't seen in him before. Something that looked, for the first time since I'd met him, entirely like his own decision and not an inheritance from his mother. My mother knew all of this. She's known for 6 years that Robert was Melissa's father. That's why she wouldn't let him walk you down the aisle. That's why she threatened to pull the venue if he showed up today. She wasn't protecting our family from embarrassment, Melissa. She was protecting herself from a truth she should have told me a long time ago. Through the vestibule doors, I could hear the string quartet finishing its warm-up, the low murmur of 200 guests settling into pews, and somewhere among them, I knew, sat Vivian Whitfield, in a dress that had probably cost more than my truck, entirely unaware that the strike plate she'd installed 6 years ago around her own worst decision was about to be tested by exactly the kind of pressure she'd spent every single one of those 6 years trying to prevent. I didn't know it yet, but the wedding was still going to happen. It just wasn't going to happen the way anyone in that building had planned for. I've spent 32 years learning that the most dangerous moment in any security system isn't the breach itself. It's the 60 seconds after, when the person who built the system realizes what's failed and has to decide, in real time, whether to patch it quietly or let the alarm keep sounding. I watched Vivian Whitfield make that decision in front of 200 wedding guests, and I watched her make the wrong one. The ceremony began 11 minutes late, which nobody but the wedding party noticed, and it began with Melissa walking down the aisle on my arm instead of Uncle Gerald's, because somewhere in that vestibule, in the space of about 4 minutes, my daughter had looked at me, really looked, the way she hadn't in over a year, and said, "I want my dad to walk me. I don't care what anyone thinks anymore. I want to tell you that walking my daughter down that aisle, past 200 faces, including Vivian Whitfield's, who went the color of old drywall the moment she saw me appear at the back of the church, felt like a victory. It didn't, not yet. It felt like carrying something fragile through a room full of people who might drop it if I let go too soon. I gave Melissa's hand to Derek at the altar. I sat down in the front pew in the seat that had been quietly, deliberately left empty. Vivian's doing, I'd learn later, a seat kept open in case I showed up, so she could have it filled at the last second by a cousin. A plan that never got executed because nobody expected me to already be standing at the front of the church with her son. The ceremony itself I'll spare you the details of, because it was, by every account, a beautiful wedding. And beauty isn't where this story earns its keep. The reception was where the strike plate finally gave. It happened during the toasts, 20 minutes into dinner. And it happened because Derek Whitfield stood up first before his best man, before anyone had planned for him to speak at all, and asked the DJ for the microphone with the specific, quiet authority of a man who has spent the last 2 hours deciding exactly what he's willing to carry into the rest of his marriage and what he's finally ready to set down in public. "I want to say something before the toasts," he said, "and it's not the speech I wrote." The room went the particular still that only happens when 200 people simultaneously sense that something real is about to occur in a space usually reserved for things that are merely nice. Vivian, seated at the head table in ice blue silk, set down her wine glass with the careful, controlled movement of a woman bracing for impact she couldn't yet name. 16 years ago, Derek said, there was a fire at a building my family owned. I was 12. I nearly died. I've spent my whole life believing that was just something that happened, one of those things, an accident, and I never knew until about 2 hours ago that the man who carried me out of that building has been sitting at our family dinners for the past year. He found me in the crowd. That man is my father-in-law, Robert Callahan. Some of you know him as Melissa's dad. I only found out this morning that I owe him my life. A murmur moved through the room, warm at first, the kind of gasp and applause a story like that earns on its own. Then Derek kept talking, and the temperature of the room changed. "What I also learned this morning," he said, "is that the fire wasn't an accident. It started in an electrical panel that had failed an inspection 8 months before it burned, and my family, specifically my mother, made a documented decision to defer the repair rather than lose 11 days of rental income. I've seen the memo. She signed it herself." He looked for the first time directly at Vivian, and his voice, when it came again, wasn't angry so much as unbearably tired, the tiredness of a man setting down something heavy he'd been carrying without knowing its weight his whole life. "And when she found out, 6 years ago, that the man who saved me was about to become my father-in-law, she didn't tell me the truth. She spent 6 years making sure I never found out, and 3 days ago, she threatened to pull the funding for this entire wedding unless Melissa uninvited her own father, because she was more afraid of Robert Callahan's silence breaking than she was of losing her own son's trust." Vivian Whitfield stood up so fast her chair nearly went over behind her. "Derek, this is not the place." "It's exactly the place," Derek said, and something in his voice cracked open fully now. 16 years of quiet finally finding its volume. "You made it the place, Mom. The day you decided my wedding was worth more to you as a piece of reputation management than it was as the day I married someone I loved. You let me grow up thinking a stranger saved my life. You let Melissa think her father embarrassed you. He installed our security system for free. He drove her to school every day for 3 years after her mother died. He gave her $60,000 for her condo, and he never once told either of us any of it because that's who he is. And I found out today that you knew exactly who he was the entire time, and decided his silence was more useful to you than his truth." I want to tell you what happened to Vivian's face in that moment, because it's the part of this story I've thought about the most since. She didn't crumble. Vivian Whitfield had spent 30 years running a company through worse rooms than this one, and some habits don't break just because the walls finally come down. What she did instead was turn, fast, toward her older son, the way a woman turns toward the one person in a room she still believes will help her control the damage. And she said, quiet enough that she probably thought only Trent could hear it, "Fix this now." Trent Whitfield stood up slowly from his seat 2 chairs down, and I watched him do something I hadn't fully understood until that exact moment was coming. I watched a man who had spent 2 years quietly restructuring his mother's company decide, in front of 200 witnesses, that this was the moment to finally spend the leverage he'd been building the entire time. "I can't fix it, Mom," he said, and his voice carried the flat, rehearsed calm of a man who had run this exact sentence through his head many times before he ever needed it, "because I'm the one who leaked the story to the tenant's attorney 4 months ago." The room, which had already gone still, went stiller. "I found the memo 18 months ago," Trent said, going through old files during the ownership restructuring, "and I sat on it because I understood what it was worth. Not to hurt you, Mom, not at first. I sat on it because I needed leverage for when you finally had to hand over controlling interest, and I always assumed I'd use it quietly, in a boardroom, the way you taught me everything gets handled. But 4 months ago, the tenant's new attorney came looking, and I made a decision. I gave her enough to keep digging, because a public lawsuit devalues the company's liability exposure just enough, on paper, to trigger the buyout clause in Dad's estate structure that hands me controlling interest the moment total liability crosses 8% of asset value. I've been counting on this exact 8% for a year and a half, Mom. I didn't know Robert Callahan was going to be the man standing in the middle of it when it finally came due. But I'm not going to pretend I'm surprised the truth found its way out. I've been quietly pushing the door open for months. I just didn't expect it to happen at my brother's wedding. There it is. The second betrayal folded inside the first, the way a good lock sometimes has a second pin stack hidden behind the one you can see. And I watched Vivian Whitfield's face go through the specific collapse of a woman, realizing that the son she'd trusted to hold up her half of the world had, in fact, been quietly dismantling it from the inside for a year and a half, waiting for exactly this kind of pressure to bring the whole structure down at once, publicly, unrecoverably, in front of every investor and family friend and business partner she'd spent 30 years cultivating. "You used your brother's wedding," Vivian said, and for the first time in 6 years of knowing her, her voice actually shook, "to force me out. You used your grandson's father-in-law's silence to protect a lie for 6 years," Trent said. "I just used the truth. There's a difference, Mom, even if you've never been able to see it." Melissa, still in her wedding dress, stood up from the head table and crossed to where I was sitting, and knelt down beside my chair the way she used to when she was small and wanted to tell me a secret at eye level, and she took both my hands in hers, gloves and calluses together, and said, "Dad, I am so sorry. I banned you from my own wedding to protect people who were never protecting me back. I spent a year embarrassed by a man who saved my husband's life, and never once asked for credit for it, and I don't know how to undo that in one afternoon." I looked at my daughter, in her wedding dress, in a ballroom that had gone almost completely silent except for the low, furious murmur of the Whitfield family collapsing in on itself 3 tables away, and I thought about Diane and what she would have said, and I found, to my own surprise, that I already knew. "You don't undo it in one afternoon," I said. "You don't undo 6 weeks of shame in one apology, sweetheart, any more than I could have undone 6 months of grief in one good cry. Forgiveness isn't something you get because the room finally saw the truth. It's something we build back slowly, the two of us, one different choice at a time, starting today." I squeezed her hands. "But I'll tell you what I do know. I know you asked for the truth the second you had it. I know you walked down that aisle on my arm the moment you had a real choice instead of Vivian's." "That's not nothing, Melissa. That's the first brick," she cried then. "The real kind. No cameras, no audience to perform for. Just her father's hands and her own 200 guests pretending very hard not to watch." Across the ballroom, before security quietly walked her toward a side exit to avoid the reporters who'd start calling within the hour, Vivian Whitfield caught my eye one final time. Whatever she'd planned to say to me in that moment, some final weaponized politeness, some last attempt to control the narrative even in defeat, she seemed to think better of it. What she said instead was smaller, and I think more honest than anything else she'd said to me in the 11 months I'd known her. "Your wife," she said, "would be very proud of the man you raised her to be." I didn't answer her. Some doors, Once they close, you don't get to walk back through just because you finally found the right thing to say on the other side of them. I just nodded once and let her go. There was one more thing she said, quieter, almost to herself. As security walked her past our table, a small, bitter comment about how it must have been easy for a woman like Diane to raise a daughter with nothing at stake. Teaching second grade, no real pressure, no real world to navigate, and I felt something in my chest go very still and very cold, the specific coldness of a man who has just heard someone insult a person who can no longer defend herself. You don't get to say her name, I said, and my voice came out quieter than I expected and steadier. You spent 6 years being afraid of a truth you created yourself, Vivian. Diane spent 29 years teaching other people's children to read. One of those is a life. I'll let you sit with which one? She didn't answer. Security walked her out through the side door, and the string quartet, after a long, uncertain pause, began playing again. Because that's what happens at weddings. The music finds a way to keep going, even through the parts nobody rehearsed. 6 months have passed since that Saturday. Trent Whitfield holds controlling interest in what's left of Whitfield Development now, considerably smaller after the tenants' lawsuit settled for an amount I'm not at liberty to state, but which I'm told made a serious dent in the company's remaining assets. Vivian lives quietly outside the city now, in a house half the size of the one she used to own, and Derek, to his enormous credit, still calls her every Sunday, because some doors you close and some doors you just leave unlocked, gently, in case the person on the other side ever decides to become someone worth walking back through them. Melissa and I talk every week now. Real conversations, not scheduled ones, not calendar managed around anyone else's comfort. She asked me, 3 months ago, if I'd teach her the trade, not to run the shop herself, but just to understand it, the way you understand a language your father speaks fluently that you'd let yourself forget. I spent a Saturday afternoon showing her how a pin tumbler lock actually works, how each pin has to sit at exactly the right height before the cylinder will turn, how a single pin out of place is the difference between a door that opens and a door that never will, no matter how hard you force it. That's kind of like us, isn't it? She said, turning a practice lock over in her hands. All those years. One pin out of place, one pin out of place, I agreed. Doesn't mean the lock's broken. Just means somebody's got to sit down and reset it, pin by pin, and be patient about it. We're patient about it. Some weeks it feels like real progress. Some weeks it feels like standing outside a church in a navy suit, waiting to see if anyone's going to look up. I've decided I can live inside both of those feelings at once, because that's what 32 years in this trade actually teaches you. Underneath all the metal and the mechanisms and the calluses, a lock only tells you what someone doesn't want you to see. But every lock, given enough patience in the right hands, eventually tells you the truth. I still drive the same white van. I still fix elderly women's garage doors for banana bread when the mood strikes me. And every March 14th, without telling anyone why, I drive past the empty lot where the larkspur used to stand, and I sit there for exactly as long as it takes to finish a cup of coffee, and then I go back to work, because some men flip tables when the truth finally comes out. I just check the strike plate, make sure it's holding, and go back to opening doors. If you liked this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories.